everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening. This is my first lecture as your new director at the museum, and I'm very, very happy to be here and happy that you all came. Before I launch into my talk, I just want to remind you that we have a whole series of lectures that are happening, and we have the beautiful concert series that Brent Runnels has organized, and it's been beautiful. So if you find that you have some time in the afternoon on a Sunday, pretty much every Sunday he's got something happening. The next one is November 4th, Matthew Anderson guitar, and then November 11th, Brent Runnels and Christina Smith on flute. So that will be really wonderful. The lecture series we are recording. Thank you, Emmanuel. So if you missed the wonderful talk Jeff Palferman gave, he is a veteran of both, he's done tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he's an OU student right now. So he did a great talk about violence in our culture and one soldier's view and his opinion on that. So that will be on YouTube, on the OU channel. You can check it out. And the last one we had was Frank Martin from the University of South Carolina with commentary by the photographer Sheila Pre-Bray. So that'll also be on YouTube. So just pick up one of these if you haven't. What else did I want to tell you? The small gallery between the skylight and the South Gallery is going to be repurposed as a changing exhibition space, or it's actually the original purpose that the founding director had as an exhibition space. And right now it's hosting Betty Londergan's global blogging experiment. She is a self-proclaimed global blogger for Heifer International. So have a look at those while you're here as well. So I'm very pleased to talk to you tonight as part of this lecture series and for the exhibition Burden of Proof, National Identity and the Legacy of War. Before I begin, I want to talk to you about why I selected this title, Burden of Proof, both for the lecture series and for the show. And the show, in case any of you don't know, was inspired by the campus-wide reading of a book called The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. And it's a fictionalized and a beautiful and harrowing account of the author's time as a soldier in Vietnam. So having read that, which all the incoming freshmen had to read, I was very inspired to bring this show to OU. But again, burden of proof. Who has the burden and what are we trying to prove? Legal burden of proof is that obligation to either prove or disprove a disputed fact. Does our argument hold water? Why should others be persuaded to adopt our view? I chose the exhibition title in part because the legacy of war in terms of finance, health ramifications, and so on is all of ours to bear, whether we're civilians or whether we're soldiers or veterans. And it may not be immediately evident, and we may be called upon to prove our case. That has certainly and most unfortunately been true for those living with the long-term effects of dioxin or Agent Orange. In a playful manner, I chose this title in part as your newly minted museum director because the onus is on me to prove myself. In a larger and much more serious museum context, this translates as how do we shape the public's perception of our shared history. That's a really important statement, and that's pretty much all you're doing as you shape something in a curatorial fashion. Creating exhibitions and displays to give a visual narrative to history or a context for a variety of artworks is delightful and it's fun. Curating is fun and it's magical, but it's also very powerful and weighty and a responsibility. We can, through exclusion or inclusion of works or text, shape a narrative which may not reflect everyone's experience. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't, and is by definition extremely subjective. For many decades, the loudest voice in museum interpretation or curation was that of the dominant or colonial culture. I'm examining how this perspective has shifted in the 250 years or so since the birth of our young country. In considering a global museum outlook, or the diversity of cultures that encompass today's American museum, it's necessary to first understand how museums have evolved since the early years of the US to the present. Before exploring that evolution, however, let's have a quick snapshot of American museums today. Before I do that, I just want to point out that this is an image from a display in Memphis at the National Civil Rights Museum. All right, so U.S. museums today. Some of these facts may be very obvious to you, and others may be a shock. There's more than 17,500 museums in the U.S. Museums preserve and protect more than 1 billion objects. That's just in this country. They provide employment to nearly 500,000 Americans. They contribute about $21 billion to the U.S. economy. However, they only receive a very small fraction of federal funding. At least 22% of all museums are located in rural areas. People tend to trust museums to be accurate repositories of history and culture, sometimes more than they trust their own families or friends, or libraries or books. Museums, some of which include zoos and aquariums. Zoos, aquariums, and libraries are also museums, which may be a surprise. They invest about $51 million a year in scientific research. And this is the real kicker, and kind of amazing to me. But there are approximately 850 million visitors each year to American museums, and that is more than the attendance for all major league sports events and theme parks combined. I think we value our sports events at our theme parks. We certainly do, I do. But isn't that stunning? Museums provide more than 18 million instructional hours for guided tours for students and staff, visits to schools, and professional development for teachers. So, to sum it up, museums, 1, serve the public. 2, they're popular destinations. We love them. They're go-to places. 3, they're economic engines. 4, they're trusted by and they serve the community. And 5, they partner with schools in education. In order to meet a set of standards that are consistent, they are often accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, the AAM, which was formerly the American Association of Museums. But how did we arrive at today's museum model? Why is this the accepted model? Before I go to the next slide, I just want to point out that this is an amazing Sol LeWitt wall drawing or mural in the interior of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford. So it's kind of a beautiful and strange juxtaposition of the old and the new. So I'd like to just take a quick glance through museum history and the different ways that we've viewed museums in this country. 1, as historic keepsake. So having a brief look gives us a glimpse about how the museums have evolved in the past couple of hundred years. The mission of America's very first museum, which is the Charleston Museum in South Carolina, is to document and explain the natural and cultural history of Charleston and South Carolina and the coastal region through the maintenance, improvement, and expansion of collections documenting the natural forms and material culture of that region. So historic museums typically document regional history or the lives of a particular person. Another example would be Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, founded in 1926, or the Mark Twain House in Hartford, which was the writer's home from 1874 to 1891. So what you see in these two photos, I love these two photos, is the Charleston Museum, which was founded before we were even a country, on the left, around the turn of the last century, and a huge whale skeleton, and that same skeleton in the modern museum today. A museum with a very long history. Museum is Curio Cabinet, so this one's for you, student out there. A great many museums, both here and abroad, began as personal collections, very idiosyncratic personal collections. In the late 18th century, artist and scientist Charles Willson Peale opened his home, quite literally opened his home, and deemed it a cabinet of curiosities. This this painting of him is a self-portrait that he painted in 1822, which is in the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philly. He intended the museum for the education of the public and attempted to include and categorize all living nature, past or present, living or previously living, past or present. He included botanical, biological, and archaeological specimens, including the very first mastodon bones unearthed in North America. You see those in the etching on the left. Now, this may come as another shock, but I think it's kind of wonderful. You see, museums are part historic keepsake, part cabinet of curiosities, amusement park, and they have been so since the beginning of museums in this country. So way before P.T. Barnum was a circus person, he was a museum administrator. From the serious to the ridiculous here. So when Charles Willson Peale's museum closed in 1840, Barnum acquired a lot of the specimens from Peale and put them on display. So he had these things that Peale, as idiosyncratic as his museum was trying to collect in a very serious, systematic way. And then he displayed them alongside things like genuine mermaid remains and the conjoined twins, Chang and Eng, and General Tom Thumb, the famous little person. And he also unsuccessfully displayed live animals, such as beluga whales, which sadly only lived for a week at a time, so they brought in several of them, pumped in seawater, but it didn't work. And the very first hippo ever seen in North America. So from the very start, American museums had an aspect of flair and fantasy and showmanship. Oh, and it was located on the lower east side, I believe, of New York. Must have been near the sea. He was trying to pump in seawater. So again, making another 180, museums as a golden temple, something lofty to aspire to. This is the extreme opposite. Many museums in the US would adopt this model and place great importance on the museum building itself, and this is still often the case. Just to digress, in the 90s there was a huge push for museums to find huge names of architects like Renzo Piano and Frank Gehry, and if you had that name, you had the cachet. But that was true also in the last century. So in 1842, Daniel Wadsworth opened the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which was the very first public art museum in this country. It's in Hartford. In 1870, the Met was founded. You see the Athenaeum on the right, and that's an interior of the Athenaeum. And on the left is the Beaux-Arts facade of the Met. That Gothic Revival building, which houses a portion of the Wadsworth, was finished in 1844. And this particular facade of the Met immediately outgrew its space, was completed in 1902. And at the time, the Evening Post reported that at last, quote, New York had a neoclassical palace of art, one of the finest in the world, and the only public building in recent years which approaches in dignity and grandeur the museums of the old world. So they would place great importance on the building itself, the objects inside, the grand approach, the entrance elevated from the street, and psychologically elevated from the masses. So this was kind of the trickle-down theory of museum studies. And it's a model that's still often embraced today. The Met also, quite successfully, became what's known as an encyclopedic museum. But probably the very best example, I would say certainly the best example of an encyclopedic warehouse or museum of objects is the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian was established from a bequest of 1826 from an English scientist who had never actually been here. He'd never traveled to the United States, but he gave his entire fortune, which at the time was $500,000, doesn't sound like very much today, but it was 1/66 of the US federal budget at the time. And he gave this bequest with the most simple, succinct mission statement possible, which was the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So this allowed for a very broad interpretation and an all-encompassing interpretation. And that's the driving reason that the Smithsonian has grown to huge, epic proportions. There are actually 19 museums and galleries, as well as the National Zoologic Park and 9 research facilities, as well as affiliates all over the country, such as some that I've recently visited since I got here, the CDC Museum, and in Atlanta, and the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, which is an amazing museum. If you haven't seen it. So, in addition to all of these things that I've mentioned, museums also, part and parcel of their development was an educational component, and that's been central to most museums' missions. In fact, in order to become accredited, they must have that as one of the first and foremost objects of their purpose of being. So in 1899, Goodyear founded what it was the very first children's museum in the world, the Brooklyn Children's Museum, and it's still thriving today. Down below you see kids in the 20s or 30s, I don't have the date of that photo, queuing up in front of the Brooklyn Museum. And at the top you see kids learning in the museum today. It's sparked the creation of more than 300 children's museums around the world. And it's changed and thrived with the times. It was also the very first museum in all of New York City to achieve leadership in energy and environmental design certification, or LEED certification through the Green Energy Council. Museum as industrial powerhouse. We've gone through all of these different iterations. Just like, well, not quite just like, but following in the footsteps of Peel, who amassed this personal collection, there have been other people who've amassed incredible personal collections, and that was never more true for this country than during the Industrial Revolution. Isabel Stewart Gardner put her own name on that museum in Boston. It was opened in 1903, and the Morgan, which was founded through J. Pierpont Morgan, opened in 1924. The beautiful painting on the left is by John Singer Sargent, and that's of Miss Stewart Gardner. And what you see in the lower right is actually what had been the personal library of Morgan. That is now part of the Morgan Museum. It's on view. So other museums established by wealthy patrons during the first half of the 20th century include the Carnegie Institute, founded by Andrew Carnegie, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, which was founded in 1931 by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. So we've had a look at several U.S. museums from around the mid-18th century through the early 20th, so let's look at other issues which have shaped museum history and development from that point on through the present. In the spirit of our current exhibition, we need to acknowledge the devastation that war has had, not only on human lives, but certainly on cultural holdings. Since the earliest civilizations, looting or disputed acquisition of cultural artifacts has occurred. There's been a global move in recent years, and recent meaning probably from the late 80s or early 90s to the present, so very recent, toward repatriation or return to the country of origin of objects. Many highly contested cases exist, and one that's been resolved recently after 100 years is that of Incan objects taken from Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham for Yale University in 1911. Now, he took those things, and I've read a great deal about this fellow. We see him standing by his tent in Peru, and these are some of the objects he brought back. And there was a loan agreement, and there was an agreement in place. It just wasn't watertight. So if ever there was a reason to vet your agreements and make sure that you've got your agreements in order, it's this. 100 years later, a settlement between the government of Peru and Yale was reached in 2010. Other controversies remain, such as that of the Elgin marbles, which are in the British Museum. They were taken from the Acropolis, they were taken from the Parthenon in the early 1880s by Thomas Bruce, who was the 7th Earl of Elgin, and they remain to this day in the British Museum. And some argue that after that much time, are they part of British history, are they part of Greek history, where should they be? Should they be repatriated? It's a very difficult, contentious issue. In recent times, the Iraq Museum was looted during an invasion in 2003. And you see a little photo, and there are many photos like this you can find online that are of this terrible looting, which took place in about a 48-hour period. In a museum that had works of art spanning 7,000 years of civilization. Almost nothing remained intact. Almost everything was either destroyed, damaged, or stolen. It was awful. And this just happened a few years ago. But however, the move toward restitution, repatriation, protection of cultural objects, and due diligence in provenance research has continued with good results. Another amazing story of art and war is the campaign that Hitler waged on Europe and the rest of the world. You can't really talk about this without examining his campaign, as much as it turns my stomach. Many people don't realize that Hitler applied to art school He was a watercolorist, and he wasn't very good, actually. Prior to every invasion, he made a sweep of museums. His intention was to create the most incredible museum in the world, naturally, in Bern, Germany. And as he stole more than 650,000 objects, he stored them in salt mines. There's an amazing documentary which is titled Rape of Europa, and it sheds a lot of light on this campaign. I highly recommend you check it out. And because Hitler was such a narcissist, he's filmed taking all of this artwork. It's incredibly well documented. So in recent years, there's been a move toward thorough research on provenance, or the history of objects of art, which have been subject to this Nazi-era looting. And one notable case that I had some familiarity with was that of an Egon Schiele painting. You see it on the right. It's called Portrait of Wally, which Schiele painted in 1912, which was exhibited at MoMA in 1997-98. That's when I was there. That's when I first arrived, and there was a huge commotion, and they didn't quite understand it. It was part of the Leopold collection, and it was supposed to be on temporary exhibition, but it stayed in MoMA for years while it was a court case, and it came to light that it had belonged to the heirs of Ms. Leah Bondi Jere. So after a very lengthy case in 2010, the Leopold actually paid the heirs to settle out of court $19 million. The photo on the left, you can see Hitler, and he's with Hermann Göring, who was also one of his henchmen, who also amassed collections. He encouraged all of his minions to amass these collections. So from the distress of war and resulting cultural fragmentation, we move on to the exploitation of objects for income and acclaim, which occurred in the latter part of the 20th century. And not exactly, I wouldn't say particularly through the fault of what the museums intended, but what they were forced to do, unfortunately. In the 70s and 80s, partly as a result of Reagan-era economics, federal funding was completely, or almost completely, slashed for museums. They were compelled to seek new revenue through private foundations, individuals, and through ingenuity in attracting new membership, sales, and marketing. This was the beginning of commercialism of the museum as a business. King Tut, Disco Tut. I don't know how many of you remember this. I was about 10 years old when the Tut exhibit came to New York, and I'll never forget the lines around the block to see the remains of the king, the mask, all of this. So there was a huge upsurge in blockbuster entertainment at museums, selling tickets, making money. And it was a prime example of that museum experience, like the fun fair of the Barnum days. More recently, in the 80s and 90s, the commercialization of museums and museum experience was evident as embodied by the Guggenheim Museum, which I love. I'm going to disparage the Guggenheim a little bit as an example, but the Mick Guggenheim, as it was derogatorily deemed, created a series of museums worldwide, spreading the Guggenheim brand to LA, to Venice, to Bilbao, and so on. They mounted shows with high commercial appeal, such as a motorcycle exhibition sponsored by BMW and an Armani design show. Federal funding, which was much less today than it was in the past, forced them to do that in part. But in part it was a commercialization, and it's been an entire departure for many museums. The need to produce revenue is a constant pressure and has the potential to skew curatorial practices. Digital world. So in the 90s, a lot of museums made a break with the past model of curator as administrator. A museum director today is, believe it or not, more likely to hold an MBA than a PhD in our history. This is a huge departure from past practices and reflects the corporate model most museums adopted. From 97 to 2004, when I was in New York at MoMA, I saw the museum move into this corporate model and into the information age. It was amazing to watch. The curatorial departments were no longer responsible for administration, and often, kicking and screaming, became liaisons to a new level of administration in the form of deputy directors and vice presidents. So ultimately, I think, although it was an uncomfortable change in structure for MoMA, for the Met, for all of these major museums, it resulted in freeing curators to focus on curation rather than administration. At the same time, all industries, museums included, were moving into the information age. So many were concerned that an internet presence, particularly with high-resolution images, digital images online, would actually discourage the visiting public. We take it for granted today, but a lot of museums did not want to go digital. They were very nervous about it. If they could visit virtually, why visit physically? That fear was proven to be unfounded, and now the web has become, over the past 20 years or so, a very effective marketing and orientation tool, a sign of legitimacy and information gathering for institutions. New museology. So this is a relatively new term, museology. It's not the history of museums, but it's really the study of museums as a whole. The understanding of their history, management, purposes, standards, practices. It's all been developed into this formal study. I think this term, and I should know, came about just within the last, say, 12, 13 years. It became widely used. It concerns thematic representations, historic interpretation, and in the past couple of decades, there have been changes to the tradition of museums serving the dominant or consumer culture. There's been a switch. Some examples of embracing a new museology could be found in these interpretive displays at the National Civil Rights Museum. Again, that's the museum in Memphis, which interestingly enough is not, you see in that image, is not showing you any original object. It's all about the experience and the reinterpretation of history. And these figures are showing sit-in during segregation, during Jim Crow. So there's been a huge shift from the object to the visitor to the experience, and that's embodied by that display. On the right, you see a redesign of the exhibition experience at an incredible museum, which I'd love to visit, the California Academy of Sciences, which has a fungible collection, in other words, a living collection of animals and plants. So this former exhibition or display shows a pivotal and painful growth experienced through the civil rights movement, and the latter shows a shift, not only in how we display things, but how we are stewards for the planet. Okay, to sum up, where are we today? That's a little postcard of the Met, the very first building of the Met as it was when it was founded. And that's the Met today. You can kind of see its bones. It looks similar. U.S. museums today reflect a little bit of all aspects, from Curio Cabinet, Historic Keepsake, Golden Temple, Encyclopedic Warehouse, a fun fair, an alternative school, an industrial powerhouse, and they concern themselves with repatriation of objects now, careful study of provenance, and a continued move into the information age with the inclusion of non-dominant cultural viewpoints in exhibition themes, displays, and interpretation. The biggest changes, I think, that have taken place in the American Museum have been from the 70s to the present. Reduced funding led to market-driven exhibitions in competition with the entertainment industry. Global interconnectedness accelerated at lightning speed. Cultural repatriation and provenance led to a complete change in collecting practices. And the focus of museums shifted from the object to the visitor, and to reflect our changing cultural makeup. That means a post-colonial rethinking of everything, from exhibition to displays to signage to programs. This re-examination, which is called the new museology, gives the museum today an added meaning or purpose as a forum, as a meeting place or a square to gather and consider ideas which impact all of our lives, no matter our country of origin, our race, our ethnicity, our beliefs, or our views. I chose to examine this evolution with the current show, Burden of Proof, as a backdrop, because this show endeavors to present a variety of cultural viewpoints. That's what I was trying to do, and to demonstrate the resonance over generations of issues of global concern. With the countries of the world more connected than ever before in the history and effects of war, ownership and responsibility, all of our many differences and viewpoints are distilled and interpreted through cultural institutions. It's a powerful responsibility. Our museums are, in essence, a mirror to our society. Thank you. This is really a very partial list of sources. There are many more. Do you have questions? Yes.
The numbers of attendees, is that a recent figure? Is it a figure that is sustained by how was that figure arrived at? First of all?
I'm not sure how it's arrived at, but it was a figure that I pulled from the AAM information of 2011, so it's a relatively recent figure. How they would determine that, I'm not sure, but I would imagine that it would only be accredited museums that they would have surveyed to get that.
But the idea of the museum becoming a more commercial space, the commercialism must be working if we're attracting so many people.
I think
and it's come for
is.
entertainment rather than the objects.
Right, right.
So how does the curator then fit into the business of curating?
That's a broad question.
Are they curating for the commercial?
Oh God, I hope not. Well, like I said, I think that at least in a larger institution, that change in corporate structure, which was very uncomfortable, understandably so, where the curator had to, presumably give up some control over the administration, it freed them up, but they still have to vet everything through a layer of bureaucracy that they never did. So I think that's difficult. I could say from personal experience that I understand the pressure to raise funding and to be viable and to market myself or market my industry. It can be very distracting from curatorial practices. You can't be a scholar in a bubble if you're trying to wear all hats. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think it makes it difficult to kind of stay on course. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the pieces and why you chose them?
Oh, sure. Specifically about this show, yeah. Well, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, it was inspired by the campus reading, which is all about the soldiers' experience in Vietnam. So what I chose was, you see behind me, the work of a young woman named Keisha Luce, who is a relative unknown. She recently finished her MFA at Dartmouth, and her father passed away at the age of 38 from what they believe was Agent Orange-related cancers. He was also an amputee, Vietnam veteran. So she took it upon herself to go to Vietnam for 3 months with a fellow named Kirk Torregrossa, and he documented what she was doing, and she interviewed people who had birth defects, again, that were presumably from the long-term effects of Agent Orange. And we're talking second, third generation, fourth generation. And she interviewed them and did these body casts, brought back the casts and created these sculptures. So juxtaposing that with these other works, this is by Din Q Lei, these woven pieces. And at first glance, they might look like they're pixelated digital images, but in fact what they are is chromogenic prints, so traditional photography that's been sliced into small strips and woven together using a Vietnamese basket weaving technique. Lei was born in 1973, and toward the end of the conflict, and then his parents and he and his family left when he was 10 and moved to California, where he finished high school and college. So he's literally taken these images to interweave his experience between being in Vietnam and echoes of the war and the commercialization of the war through public perception, American perception. Some of the images show, there's one toward the back that shows Catherine Deneuve in the movie Indochine, and Jane Fonda, who of course was a big anti-war protester, juxtaposed with these paratroopers. So those people's work. The beautiful posters you see were borrowed from the Rubin collection in New York. Donald Rubin, who is a wonderful benefactor of the museum and of OU. He's an Oglethorpe alum. And they're North Vietnamese propaganda posters, original posters. And then in the far gallery, the South Gallery, is the work of Sheila Pre-Bright, who lives in Stone Mountain, and who is the daughter of a veteran, and who is a self-proclaimed Army brat, who's lived all over the world. And she did a series called Young Americans that was originally shown at the High a couple of years ago through a grant from Aetna, and it traveled north, which is where I saw it, in Connecticut, But what it is a series of, again, high-resolution chromogenic prints of young people between the ages of 18 and 25 holding the American flag in some way that's meaningful to them. All she did was control the backdrop and the lighting. She handed them the flag and said, do whatever you want. And you title what you've done, and if you want a statement, you do that. So those are their own choices, how they're posed. So, other questions? Yes?
I was thinking about another connection to the commercialization of museums, and that is tourism.
Right.
And getting people to come to your city, especially since you included aquariums. That seems to, that seemed to be the favorite of cities for a certain period of time, including Atlanta.
Which has the most amazing aquarium.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I expect that, it seems like that's always been somewhat the case, but it seems to have taken on, would you agree, a different kind of thrust or energy in recent years?
I think so. I think part of it is competition with the entertainment industry because things have become so immediate in the information age. And part of it, I mean, the catalyst was certainly the loss of funding in the 70s and 80s. But museum studies, museology as a whole is really very young, I think. I mean, museums have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, you know, but at the same time, I think that they've now distilled into a real industry with parameters. And I think that's part of what's happened just in the last couple of decades. Well, I just want to tell you one thing as a little teaser. I've got a few people here. That the spring show is set, and so is the summer show. The spring show is called Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews and the Promised Land. And will be a photojournalistic view of the last 30 years of people leaving the region of Gondar and traveling north to find some kind of new life and settlement in Israel. And the summer show will be Japanese porcelain and prints, woodcuts from regional collections. So mark your calendars, and I'll have that posted soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.